Hey there guys, welcome to the CodeLab channel and welcome to part 2 of mastering DOM manipulation. In this video we're going to be using everything we learned in part 1 and applying it to 5 different projects ranging from beginner to master level. As always guys, if you like the content, make sure you hit the like button as it helps out with the algorithm, and if you're new here, consider subscribing and turn on all notifications so you never miss an update. So just like in part 1 guys, there's going to be a few prerequisites. In order to effectively understand the DOM and how it relates to these projects, I highly recommend checking out part 1 first, as well as also having an existing knowledge of HTML and CSS. Now in regards to styling, we're not going to be focusing too much on it for our projects because this isn't really the goal of the course. However, there will be substantial CSS styling involved. And then lastly, it's going to be essential to have familiarity with the fundamentals of JavaScript and the syntax and the code structure, because obviously we're going to be using JavaScript in this course. Alright guys, so our first project for this course is going to be this beginner friendly quote generator that houses a quote and then has a reference by someone famous underneath it. Now underneath that reference of that famous person, we have a button which says new quote, and if I click on this, you'll see it'll just generate us some new quotes by someone else famous. So a pretty cool design and quite simple to create. Now some of the key concepts we're going to need for this project is document.querySelector, add event listener of course, the math object and inner text property. So now we know what we're creating and the key concepts we're going to need. Let's head into VS Code now and create our quote generator. Alright, so we're inside VS Code and you can see we're inside a folder called Master DOM Manipulation Part 2, inside of a index.html file, as well as having a style.css file and a JavaScript file for our project 1, and also have an image folder which has all of our images, which is just going to be the background image for all of our projects. So the first thing we want to do is include a link to our style sheet. So we'll go inside here and we'll grab style.css. Now the next thing we'll do is go and get a Google font. So we'll head over to Google, and the global font we're going to be using for our project is going to be a Roboto Regular 400. So we'll just grab the link here inside Google Fonts, head back into VS Code, and then just paste it underneath the style sheet there, and then just tab this over so it is looking all neat. And what we'll do as well is just put a comment here, so global font links, and we'll do the same for the style sheet. And then lastly, what we'll include in the head tag is just a link to Font Awesome, so we can grab all of our icons that we're going to be using throughout the project. So we're heading to our Font Awesome CDN here, and then we click the first link, so we copy the link tag, head back into VS Code, and then just paste it under our Google Fonts. So we'll just say Font Awesome link, paste that in there, close that off, and then let's open this up with Live Server. So we have our blank canvas and we can see all of our work, and we'll split screen this and just get a bit smaller. So we're ready to start a markup for our first project. So if we take a look at the original example, you can see we have two sections here. So we have our heading, and then we also have the main section which houses the quote, the famous person and the button. So we'll head inside the body. We'll just put a comment here for project 1, say quote generator, and we're going to house this project inside a div with a class of container. Hit tab, and then again we're going to need a header, so we'll just put another div here with a class of header. We'll put in here a h2, and we'll say JavaScript quote generator. So you'll see that there in Live Server, and then underneath the header we're going to have this content here which houses the quote as well as the name of that specific person who said the quote, and then the button underneath which will generate a new quote for us. So we'll head back into this blank canvas there, we'll go underneath the header and we'll just create a div with the class of main content, which again is just going to house everything. Scroll down a little bit, and then the first thing we're going to need is the actual text area. So we can just put a div, call it text area. Inside of that we want to have a span which has the class of quote, which is going to be our quote, and then I'm going to paste our quote inside of here, which is the exact same as the original example. And then underneath the text area div we want to have a div for the actual famous person who said the quote. Let's keep it simple and just say person, hit tab, and then this person for this quote is Abraham Lincoln. So we have our quote now, as well as having the person who said the quote. And then of course underneath this we're going to have the button. So we'll house the button inside of a div with a class of button area, and this is going to house our button. So this button is going to have an ID of, say, new quote, because we're going to need to grab onto this later, and we'll just put in here the text of new quote. So that's essentially it for our markup. Let's head into the style sheet now and just apply some general styles first. So we'll just put in here general styles. So we'll use the asterisk to grab everything, and we're going to say margin 0, padding 0, box size into border box. Let's also make sure that the font family for all of our projects is our Lato font. We'll just have sans serif as a backup. And then let's first grab the body element, because we want to use display flex to center everything. So we'll say justify content to the center, align items to the center. Let's use the height and make it not 1100 viewport heights, which would be the whole height of our window there. And then let's also text align everything to the center. And then the next thing I want to do is include our background image for our first project, which is this sort of library image here. So to do that, we'll grab the background property, URL, grab the image folder, head inside it and grab project 1. Now this is way too big at the moment, so the first thing I want to do is add a few more bits of styling. So we want no repeat. We want to center everything on the X and Y, and then we want this to cover the whole body. So as you can see now, it looks pretty much exactly the same as our original example. So that's it for the body there. Next thing I want to do now is grab the container class, which houses everything. I want to give this a width of 550 pixels, a height of 450 pixels. Now the next thing I want to do is just style our heading, which is the JavaScript quote generator text there. So we'll grab the header class. Let's increase the font size of this to, let's say, about 1.2 rem. Let's give this a border of solid, say about 2 pixels, and make it a nice white color. Change the color of the text to white. Let's make that a bit clearer, so we'll change the background color to a bit of a darker gray. Let's also add a bit of padding there between the text and the border, so about 5 pixels. And let's make the width of this to be about, say, about 80%. Set the margin to let's say 20 pixels from top and bottom, and then auto on the left and right, so this is centered. Now let's actually make the edges of our border here a bit more rounder. So we'll use the border radius method property. Let's make it about 5 pixels. I just think that looks a little bit better. So that's it for our heading. Now let's grab the main content, which is basically just all of our content here. So the quote, the person who said the quote, and then the button itself. So this is a class of main content. So what I want to do is just make the width of this be 100%. The height, let's make about 300 pixels. The padding, let's give this a background color of white. So there's our content. Let's also make the edges more rounded, so say border radius, say about 15 pixels. Let's also add a bit of padding here between the content and the edges, so we'll say about 50 pixels on the top and bottom, about 40 pixels on the left and right. Next thing I want to do is actually give this a box shadow, so it gives it more of like a 3D look. So say 0 on the X and Y, but let's put about 10 pixels blur, so the box shadow is all the way around, which I think looks a lot better there. Now let's style the text or the quote. So this is the main content and the text area. So let's just give this a font size of about, let's say 1.5 rem, see what that looks like. Yeah, I think that looks pretty good. So also add a bit of line height here of 1.5, give it a bit of breathing room, and yeah, I think that looks pretty good. Now we want to style the person who says the quote, so we'll say main content dot person, and let's increase the size of the text, so we'll say font size, let's say about 1.6 rem. Yeah, looks pretty good. Change the color to red. Let's think the original is capitalized, so text decoration uppercase. So text transform uppercase. Now of course we want to add a bit of margin here, so let's say margin top about 20 pixels. So I think that's starting to look a lot like the original, as you can see there. Now let's now style the button. So we'll grab the button area, which houses the button, and we'll grab the actual button itself. Let's change the background color to that dark gray. Let's change the color of the text so we can see it to white, and let's increase the font size of this to say 1.2 rem. Let's actually make that a bit bigger, 1.3, and then let's add a bit of padding, of course. So we'll say 10 pixels on the top and bottom, about 15 pixels on the left and right. Let's also add a bit of margin to the top of this to separate it from that text there. So margin top, let's say about 20 pixels, and then let's make it rounded on the edges, so border radius, let's say about 5 pixels. So the last thing I want to do here is that when we click on this, you can see in the original when we click on this it actually changes color, so we need to change its active state. So we'll just grab this and let's grab the active pseudo class, and we'll say the background color, let's make it a light blue. So that's pretty much it for the styling. All we need to do now is start applying some logic to this so we can generate new quotes when we click on this new quote button. So the first thing we're going to need to do is head into the index.html file and just go underneath all of this content here and just put a comment for scripts, because this is where we're going to be placing all of our scripts, and then we're just going to link to that script file, or our first script file, so we'll source it to, it's called project1.js. project-1.js. So we've linked it to our JavaScript file, so we'll head into that. The first thing we're going to need to do is just create some variables. So we're going to need a variable for our button here, as well as the quote and the person that said the quote. So we'll just put a comment here saying variables, and we'll say let btn equal document dot query selector, and then we'll select the button, which has an ID of new quote. So we've stored our button inside that variable there. We'll create another variable now for our quote itself. So we'll just call this quote, and we'll set this to document.query selector, and I believe this has a class of quote. Close that off. So now we've stored the span, which has the quote inside of it, inside that variable there. And then lastly, we're going to need one more for the person, and we'll say document.query selector, and this has a class of person. So we've got our three variables there. Now the next thing we're going to need is an array for all of our quotes. So we'll call this array, let's call it quotes. Now I'm going to copy and paste all the quotes I used in the original example, which I just found on the internet. I'm not really sure if those individuals actually said those quotes, but if you guys want to use different quotes and people for your quote generator, feel free to do so. So I'm just going to paste those in there. So there's all our quotes there, which I think is a total of 10 quotes. So the next thing we're going to do here is now apply an event listener to our button here. So when we click on this button of new quote, it will generate a new quote for us. So one of these quotes by one of these individuals. So we'll go underneath the array and we'll say btn dot add event listener, and we're going to look out for a click event, and we're going to have a function. Now inside of our function here, we're first going to need to create a variable which houses a basic math equation, which is essentially just going to involve the built-in math object and a couple of its methods. So let's call this variable, let's call it let random. Now as I just mentioned, JavaScript has that built-in math object, and this object has several methods. Now the two that we're going to be using in this equation are math.floor and math.random. Now we'll go over the equation again, but I'm first just going to create it quickly because it's just a bit easier to explain. So the let random is going to equal math.floor, and then inside of this method here we're going to have math again dot random, and we're going to times this by our quotes array dot length, which is essentially just all the quotes in our array. So again, how this equation is working is that the math.random times the quotes.length will generate a number between 0 and the total number of quotes inside of our quote array. Now because math.random doesn't actually generate a whole number, we need to wrap this equation in math.floor, or the floor method, which essentially just rounds a number downwards to the nearest integer. And what this will do now is allow us to access our properties inside of our array, which are the variables of quote and person. So that's essentially how this variable and this math equation is working here. Now this equation will randomize through our quotes array. However, we need to display the quote and person inside of our array to a string format. So to do that, we'll go underneath the variable here, and let's grab quote first, and we need to change the inner text. And then we're going to set this to equal the quotes array square brackets to turn it into a string format, and then we'll put in the random variable, and we'll say dot quote, and then we'll do the exact same thing, but we'll do it for person. So I'll just change this to person, and this now should randomize through our quotes array and display new quotes said by different people. So if we go to the button and we click on the button, it's generated us new quotes, and it's also given us different people who have said those quotes. And that is our first project completed. So a pretty cool project and pretty straightforward to create. Alright guys, so the next project in this course is the Beginner Plus project, which is a modal. Now a modal is essentially just a UI element that appears in the foreground of a website, and they're usually triggered by the user, allowing them to view more information or complete an action without having to navigate to another URL. In our case, it's just going to show more information. So we have our UI element here in the foreground, and then if I click on this, you can see another box animates downwards. The rest of the content darkens, so it puts a lot more focus in the box in the middle, and that's essentially what our modal is here. Now of course in this box you'd likely have more information, but I just wanted to keep it simple for this example. Now the key concepts we're going to need for this project, switched it up a little bit. We're going to be using the document.getElementById, of course the add event listener method, the e.target, and we're going to be using CSS styling throughout JavaScript, and we're also going to include some CSS animation in this project. So let's head into VS Code now and create our modal. Alright guys, so we're back inside our master DOM manipulation part 2 folder, and as you can see we've got our blank canvas there open up in live server. So the first thing we're going to need for our markup is just going to be the modal open button. So we'll just put a comment in here, modal open button, which is the button, if we take a look at the original example, this button here, which is going to trigger our modal. So we're just going to have a button. This is going to have an ID of open btn, because we're going to be using get element by ID for this example. And we're just going to put a paragraph tag in here, and this is just going to have the text of where's our modal. So that's it for the open button. Now the next thing we're going to need is the actual modal itself. So we're just going to put a comment in here, say modal and modal background. So we're going to have a div with the ID of modal container. Inside of that, we're going to have our div with the ID of modal, which is going to be our modal. Paragraph tag inside of that, which is going to say here I am. And then underneath that, we're going to have another div, which is going to be our close button. So we're just going to have, let's say div, we'll give this an ID of close btn. And to create that X, we're just going to be using a HTML entity. So it's going to be an ampersand times semicolon, and that's going to be that cross that you can see there. So that's all we're going to need for the markup. The next thing I want to do is just quickly comment out this script for project 1, but duplicate this and then link it to project 2. So if I actually open this up, you can see I've created another JS file, which is project 2. Just close that back up. So the next thing I want to do now is just apply some styling. So we'll head inside the style sheet, and the first thing I'm going to do is get that background image that you see here in the original example. So we're just going to grab the body, and we're going to change the background to URL, and this is going to be the image folder, project 2, and then apply those same rules that we did in the previous example. So no repeat, center, center, and then we're going to have cover, so we'll be able to see the image there. And then to make it the whole height of the browser, I'm just going to change the height to 100 viewport heights. So there's our image. Now the next thing I want to do is actually position this relative, because I want to initially position our button here a little bit further down and slightly to the right, just like it is in our example here. So what we're going to do is now grab that button, which has the ID of open button. I'm just going to open our modal. Set the position of this to be absolute, so we can now position this anywhere on our browser there. I'm going to say top, say about 70%, and then let's also from the left about 10%. Now let's start giving this a bit of styling so it looks a little bit better. We'll give this a width of 350 pixels, make it a bit bigger, and we'll also give it a height, let's say about 80 pixels. Let's make the font size a bit bigger, so say about 2 rem, see what that looks like. Yeah, it looks pretty good. And let's make the background transparent, just like the original. Change the color of the text to white so we can see it. Let's also change the color of the border. Let's make it solid, 2 pixels white. Now let's also let's add a bit of border radius to the edges, just because I think it looks a lot neater when the edges are rounded. So let's say about 10 pixels, and maybe a bit of padding, so say about 5 pixels there. That looks pretty good. Let's also use our good friend box shadow, give it that nice 3D effect. So we say 0 on the X and Y, but 3 pixels blur, so it goes all the way around. Let's make it black, the blur. Yeah, looks good. Now, if we take a look at the original, you can see there's an effect on there, so we need to add a transition. Transition, say about 5 seconds. So that's pretty much it for that styling. The next thing I want to do obviously is add a bit of a hover effect, so we'll just grab this. So we'll just grab this and paste it in here, hover effect or hover class, and we'll change the background color. We'll change the background color to white, and then the text to black. So there's that effect, which is the exact same as our original there. That looks pretty good. Now the next thing I want to do is style our modal here, which is going to be that box that shows up when we click on this button here. So as the class of modal, and then we'll change the background color of this to be white. We'll set the position of this to be absolute, and we'll say, let's scroll down so you can see, we'll say top 50%, left 50%, and then transform, translate, and we'll say negative 50% and negative 50%, which would basically just center this in the middle. So this is just another way to actually center content instead of using Flexbox or CSS Grid. Now I want this to be a bit bigger, so we'll say width, so 200 pixels, height, let's say 100 pixels, give it a bit of padding on the top and bottom, and then 20 on the left and right. The old classic border radius, give it those rounded edges, and then the font size, let's make this a bit bigger. Let's say 1.5 rem. Now this is actually not going to display at the moment, but I just want to create the styling here, so we don't have to do it afterwards. Now this modal is actually wrapped inside of the modal container, which we're going to be displaying as none initially because we don't actually want this to show, but I just wanted to start everything first before I make this sort of disappear initially. Now the next thing I want to do is, if we take a look at the original example, you can see that the text is on the left and the X is on the right. So to do that, we're going to be using display flex. So we have like a nested flex box, and then we'll just say justify content space between, and then we'll align the items vertically to the center. Now if we take a look again at the previous example, click off this, you can see this actually animates from the top. So we're going to be using keyframes to do this. So I'm going to create an animation, say animation name. We're going to call this animate modal, and then we want the animation duration, which is going to be 0.4 seconds. We'll create this animation right at the end, but I just wanted to again put all the styling on this modal first before we get to that. So the next thing I'm going to do is style the cross here. So this has a class of, not a class, sorry, an ID of close btn, font size, let's make this about 3 rem, so it's nice and big. And then let's apply a hover to this, so when we hover over it, it turns red. So close btn. Let's make it also a cursor pointer. Font size. Let's also make sure this is 3 rem, and then change the color to a red color. So let's say F000. So there's our cross there. Now just to quickly mention, guys, this is the same style sheet we were using in the previous project, so it has those general styles there, just in case that confused some people. But anyway, we've done the modal now, so what we need to do is actually grab the modal container and actually initially make this disappear. So we'll grab the modal container and we'll display this as none. Comment this out so we can still see it, but what I want to do is actually position this to fixed, so it's right at the top there, and we'll say top 0, and then left 0, width 100%, and then the height to also be 100%, and then have the Z index here. Let's have this at 1, so it's above everything. So let's just uncomment this now so we can no longer see it. So that's nearly it for the styling. There's still some styling in regards to the animation, which we can do in just a moment, but let's first start applying some JavaScript to this. So we'll head into the project2.js file, and the first thing we're going to need to do is just create some variables. So one for the open button, one for the modal container, and then one for the close button. So we'll just put in here comment for variables. We'll say let open btn equal document dot get element by ID, which we're going to be using for this example, and this has an ID of open btn, and then we'll create another one for the modal container. So we'll say modal container equals document dot get element by ID, and this has an ID of modal container, and then one more for the close button. So close btn equals document dot get element by ID, and this has an ID of close btn. So that's it for the variables. The next thing I want to do is now start writing out our event listeners. So we'll just put in here event listeners. So the first one we're going to apply it to is the open btn variable, so the open button. So we'll say open btn dot add event listener, look out for a click event function, and inside of this function we're going to be using CSS styling. So we're going to grab the modal container and we're going to grab the style attribute, and then inside of the style we're going to be using the display property. Set this equal to block, because if we take a look at the style.css, you can see we have this as displayed as none. Now we wanted to display it as block when we click on the open button, which is this button here. So if I click on this now, it should show us our modal. As you can see, it's popping up in the center there. So this event listener is working. Now we can't actually click off of this modal, so we can't really close it. We're going to need a couple more event listeners. So we'll do one for the close button there. So we'll say close btn, add event listener, look out for a click event function, and inside of this function we'll apply the same sort of styling. So we'll say modal container dot style display attribute display property, and then we'll set this to none, so we'll just revert it back to none. So now we've got our two event listeners here. We've got our open button, and then for our close button there, if we click on this, this should get rid of our modal, and as you can see, that's working now. Now if we take a look at the actual original example, if we click on this and we show our modal, it closes if we click on the close button here, but if we also click outside anywhere of our modal here, you can see it closes the modal too. So I want to add another event listener so we can do that. So we actually apply this to the window object. So this is actually the highest object in the DOM tree. This goes above the document. So we'll say look out for a click event function again. We'll insert the event object in there, and then inside of the function itself we're going to use an if statement. So we're going to say if e.target. If you guys remember back to the part 1 of this course, the event.target essentially just returns the element that triggers the event, which in this case is going to be our window. So we're going to say if e.target is equal to modal container, we're going to grab the modal container, use the same style attribute display property, and we're going to equal this to none. So again, what this should do now is when we click on this to activate our modal, so we can see it on the screen, we should be able to click anywhere outside of this modal and the modal will disappear. So as you can see, that's working. If I click up here, disappears, click up there, disappears, and if we also click on the close button, it will disappear. So that's pretty much it for the JavaScript. Pretty simple design really, and quite simple to create. The next thing I want to do is just apply some styling to the modal and the modal container, because if I click on this you can see that the background darkens around the modal, as well as the modal smoothly animating from the top of the browser there. To do that, we'll head back inside our style.css, and to create that nice animation, you can see we've got animation name and the animation duration. We're going to be using keyframes, so we'll just say, put a comment here first, modal animation section. We'll say the @keyframes rule, username which is animate modal. Is that, oh, it's not got a capital M. And what we want to say is just use the from and to. So from, I'm going to say top negative 300 pixels. Set the opacity to 0 so we can't see it, and then 2, I'm going to say from the top 50%, and then the opacity to 1. So as you can see, when we're typing this keyframe out, the animation is working. So I'm just going to click off this, click on our open button, and you can see now the modal is animating exactly the same as the original. And lastly, I just want to create this this dark background when the modal appears. So to do that, we're going to go in the modal container here, or the ID of modal container, add a background color RGBA. We'll say 0 for red, 0 for green, 0 for blue, and then for the alpha, which is the opacity, we'll say 0.2. And as you can see, it just gives the modal container, which is wrapping around the modal, a nice dark effect, which just gives us a good emphasis on the modal itself. So this now looks exactly like our original example. So it looks pretty good. So our third project is going to be an accordion. Now what an accordion does is let you squeeze in a lot of content into a small space in a web page. And a classic example is like one in our project here, which is an FAQ, or frequently asked question, which you'll most likely see utilized in many websites. So as you can see here, we have a couple of questions, just some random questions like a return policy or where they're located. And if I click on one of these, you'll see it open up and show us more content, which again is a really useful project to learn, as you're most likely going to be utilizing this type of design in many of your own projects. Now the key concepts we're going to need in this tutorial are document.getElementByClassName this time, of course the add event listener, the for loop, the this keyword, and the class list and toggle method. So let's add into VS Code now and create our accordion. Alright guys, so the first thing we're going to need to do is create the markup for the accordion. So we're going to have a class of accordion, which basically just houses everything, or the accordion. Then I'm going to have a h2, the class of say accordion title. And we'll say frequently asked questions. And underneath that, we're going to have several containers, which is going to house the question and the answer. And you guys can put as many of these containers as you like, but I'm just going to use 3, which is the exact same as our draft example. So we're going to create that class of content container. And this is also going to be the class that we link to our JavaScript, so we can show that extra content. So inside of these, we're going to have class of question. So the question, first question is, what is the return policy? And then we're going to have the class of answer, which is just going to be some dummy text. And then we'll just duplicate this container 2 more times. Again, you guys can include more if you like, but we're just going to stay the same as the draft example. So that's essentially it for the markup. Let's head into the style sheet now and just apply some styling to this. Now the first thing we're going to do is just grab the body and include our background image. So this is going to have a URL, image folder, project 3, and then a few more bits of styling. So no repeat, center on the X and Y, and then cover so we can see the whole image. Make this the whole height of the browser, and then use flexbox again to center our content, and then align items to the center. So that's all we need for the body. Let's start applying some styles to the accordion, which pretty much just houses everything. We're going to give this a width of 65%. background color. Let's give it a white background color. Add a bit of padding. So let's say about 30 pixels all the way around. And then of course our good friend border radius, just to make the edges more rounded. So we'll apply 30 pixels there. Now for the title itself, we'll go and give that a bit of styling. This has the accordion title styling. Scroll down so you guys can see it a bit clearer. We'll just add some margin bottom of 30 pixels to separate it from the rest of the content, and then text the line to the center. So it's centered there. Now let's apply some styling to our questions there. So grab the accordion, content, container, and then grab the question or class of question, and let's give this some padding too. So 18 pixels on the top and bottom, 0 pixels on the left and right, and let's also increase the font size a little bit to 22 pixels. Set the cursor to a pointer, and then let's add a border bottom here of 1 pixel solid black, so it has a line underneath the questions, just so it's a bit clearer to see the separation between that and the content. And then the next thing we need to do here is set a position of relative. That's because we're going to be positioning the open and close sections that you see here in the original example absolute to our question class. So that's what we're going to go ahead and do now. So we'll grab the accordion class, content, container, question class, and we're going to be using the pseudo element of after, and we'll go inside this and we'll grab the content property and use a plus sign in there, and then we'll position this absolute, and then from the right we'll say about -5 pixels. So I think that looks pretty good there. Let's now focus on this content here, so the dummy text. So we'll go underneath this bit here, grab the accordion class, grab the content container, and then we'll grab the answer class, which is the dummy text, and we'll add a bit of padding top of 15 pixels, just so it separates it from the border bottom there. We'll increase the font size of this to about 22 pixels as well, and then let's add a bit of line height, let's say 1.5 between the content, and then make sure the width of this is 100%. Now of course we want this content to be hidden initially like it is in the original example. So to do that, what we're going to need to do is change the height of our answer class there to 0 pixels. Now if you take a look at the browser, you can see that all of the content is overflowing. It's doing exactly what we want it to do by setting the height to 0 pixels, but of course all this content here we want it to be hidden. So what we can do to hide that is just use the overflow property and set that to hidden, and as you can see all of that content isn't showing. Now one last thing I want to do in here is that if we take a look at the original example, we open this up, you see it's nice and smooth. So to do that, we're going to need to set the transition of this to be about 0.5 seconds, so that when we do apply the JavaScript and we click on these, it'll be nice and smooth. So that's almost it for the styling. We're going to need a few more bits in just a moment, but first we need to create the JavaScript to get this all working. So we'll head into the JavaScript file there, and the first thing I want to do is just create a variable. I'm just going to put a comment in here, variable, and this variable is going to be called accordion, and we're going to be using the document.getElement by class name. So this is going to select all of the elements with this class name, and we want to select the content container classes, which houses the question and the answer. Now we're going to want to access all of these classes, and to do that we're going to need a for loop. So we're just going to put in for, we're going to have a variable of I equals 0, and then we're going to say I is less than the accordion dot length, and if it is less than the accordion dot length, which it will be, we want to increment this I variable by 1. Then inside of this for loop, because we're essentially selecting all of the classes of content container, we want to apply an event listener on each of these. So we'll grab the accordion and then grab the variable of I inside of our for loop, and then add an event listener here in where we want a click event. So on each of the content containers we want a click event. Then we're going to include a function, and then inside of this function what we want to do is reference the object of which the function is a property, or in other words reference the object that is currently calling the function, which in this case is our accordion. And we could do that by using the this keyword, and then using this we can insert a class of active on all of those reference points, which are essentially our content containers. So we'll say class list dot toggle, which is just another method which I actually forgot to mention in part 1, but what this essentially does is just toggle between adding and removing a class name for an element with JavaScript. And the class that we want to toggle is of course the one I just mentioned, so we want to call this class active, which I'll show you guys in a minute why we need to do this. So what we've done here is store all our elements with a class of content container inside of this variable of accordion. We've then looped through this variable, and this has allowed us to add an event listener to all of our content container classes, and inside of the function we've then referenced this object that is calling the function, i.e. our accordion variable, and then added the toggle method to either add or remove the class of active. So all we need to do now is head back into our CSS and apply the styles to our active class we created inside of this function. So we'll head back to style.css again, and then what we'll do is just put a comment here and say JavaScript styling link. Go underneath here and then just grab the class of accordion, grab the content container class, select the active class we created inside of our JavaScript, and then grab the answer, or the class of answer, which is all of that content which has a dummy text inside of it, and then just set a height of this to be 150 pixels. So what this should do now is, using the JavaScript we just created, toggle the class of answer so that when we click on any of the questions, the height of the answer container will be 150 pixels instead of 0 pixels, and then show us all that content. So if I click on this, you can see now it's opening up and showing us all that content. So you can see that the JavaScript is working, as well as the styling we just created with the active class, we just inserted with the active class. So just a few little bits here now to finish off. So we'll just grab the accordion, grab the content container, grab the active class again, and we'll grab the question. So I just want to change some styling to the question when this is clicked. So let's affect the font size so it's a little bit smaller, so we'll say about 18 pixels, and we want this to be smooth, so we'll just put a transition of 0.5 seconds. So as you can see, this shrinks down when we click on this, just so it puts more emphasis on the content there. And then lastly, let's change the open button to a close section when we click on it, just like it does in the original example here, as you can see there. So let's go underneath this, grab the accordion class again, content container dot active, and dot question after pseudo element. Change the content to a dash. Let's also increase the font size of this to 30 pixels. Let's give it a nice transition, 0.5 seconds. And as you can see there, it's all working perfectly fine. The JavaScript's all working, as well as the styling. So that's going to be it for this project. Another really useful project to learn, as you'll most likely run into needing something of this project's nature. So for our fourth project, we're going to be upping the ante a little bit and creating this pretty cool stopwatch, which, as you can see here, we have a play and also a reset button. If I hit the play button, you'll see it transform to a pause button as the stopwatch is starting. If I pause it, it will pause on that number, and then I can also reset this if I want to. So a pretty cool design, and we're going to be implementing much more JavaScript for this project. Some of the key concepts we're going to need for this project are document.querySelector, document.getElementById, add event listener, if statements, the toString method, the setInterval method, and inner HTML. So now we know the project and the key concept we're going to need for the project. Let's head into VS Code now and create our stopwatch. Alright guys, so we're inside our index.html file, and the first thing we'll do is just create a div with a class of container. And inside of that div, we're going to house another div which is going to have an ID of timer, and inside of this we're just going to display our timer. Then underneath that we're going to have our buttons, so we're going to have a div with a class of buttons, and then we'll have the stop button, and this is going to have, initially when we're first showing this, we're going to have an icon, and this is going to have a class of fa-solid fa-play, and we're also going to give this an ID of play. And then we'll just duplicate this for the reset button, reset btn, and this is going to have an ID of reset, and instead of play it's going to have arrow dash rotate dash left. So that's all we're going to need for our markup. Let's head into style.css and just apply some styling here. So first thing we're going to have is the body, and we're going to include our background image just like in the previous examples, but first let's just make the height 100 viewport heights, background URL img project 4, and of course some of that classic styling, so no repeat, center cover, so we can see the whole image. So there's our guy there, and then we want to position everything in the center, so let's display this as flex, justify content center, align items to the center. Now let's grab the container which houses everything, and this is going to have a width of 60%, a height of 250 pixels, background color is going to be white. Let's give it that nice border radius, 30 pixels, and then let's just give this a bit of shadow, so 0 on the X and Y, and then 3 pixels blur, so it's all the way around. Now the next thing I want to do is style the timer here, so this is an ID of timer, set the width of this to be 100%, font size, let's make it 72 pixels, so nice and big. Text align this to the center, give it a bit of margin, so 0 on the top and bottom, auto on the left and right, and then let's also give this a bit of padding top, let's say 35 pixels, just to push it down a little bit. Now as for the buttons themselves, we'll grab the buttons class which houses the buttons, we'll text align this to the center, and then let's give it a bit of margin on the top, let's say about 40 pixels, and then let's style the buttons here, so let's give a bit of margin between them so they're not like squished up next to each other. So let's say 0 on the top and bottom, about 10 pixels on the left and right, give them that space. Let's also remove the border, both of them, and then let's style the actual icons, so button I, say font size, let's say about 2 rem, padding, so about 10 pixels, and then let's change the color to white. Now we can't actually see those really clearly, so let's grab the IDs of each of those. So we've got one for play, duplicate that. One for pause, which we'll create later, and one for reset. Now for play, this is just going to have a background color of green. For reset, this is going to have that background color of red. And then for pause, it's going to have a background color of orange. And that gives them their background color. Now the buttons here actually aren't the same size, so let's just quickly make these the same size. So we'll say about 50 pixels. Yeah, that looks a lot better. So that's pretty much it for the styling. Let's head into the project4.js file now and start adding some functionality to our stopwatch here. Alright guys, so the first thing we're going to need to do is just create some variables for our buttons. So I'm just going to put here variables for buttons, and we're going to say const start stop btn equals document dot query selector, and then we're just going to select the ID of start stop btn, and then we're going to have one more for our reset. So reset btn equals document dot query selector, and this has the ID of reset btn. So there's the variables for our buttons. The next thing I want to do now is just define a few variables to hold time values. So put a comment here again, time values. So we'll say let seconds equal 0, let minutes also equal 0, and then let hours equal 0. So that's all the variables we're going to need at the moment. The next thing I want to do is actually create our stopwatch function, which is going to determine when our stopwatch needs to increment to the next number, i.e. seconds, minutes or hours, as well as displaying that value in the UI. So we'll just put in here stopwatch function, and then we'll just say function. We'll call this stopwatch. So firstly, what we want to do when we invoke this function is actually increment the seconds. So when this fires off, when we press the play button, the seconds will start to increment. So we'll just say seconds plus plus. Now of course, if we leave it like this, it's just going to increment the seconds. It's not going to jump to the next value. So if we want it to increment when it gets to the minutes and the hours, what we're going to need to do is just create an if statement, and then we're going to say seconds divided by 60, which is the amount of seconds, is equal to 1. We then want seconds to jump to 0, and then we want the minutes to increment. So what we're saying here is that once this reaches 60, our seconds will restart, and then the minutes will start incrementing. So that's how we increment the next value. Now of course, we haven't just got minutes, we've also got hours, so we need to include that as well. So we'll apply the same logic here. So minutes divided by 60 is equal to 1. The condition we want is that minutes reverts back to 0, and then the hours increment. Now what we need to do from here is actually create a variable to display this if statement in the browser, so our stopwatch will actually increment, otherwise the numbers will just stay static the way they are now. So to do that, we're just going to need to go underneath this if statement here and say, let's say let display timer equal document dot get element by ID. We're going to get the ID of timer, and we're going to change the inner text. Just scroll down a bit so you guys can see that. And we're going to set this to equal hours plus colon plus minutes plus a colon again, and then finally seconds. Close that off. So what we're doing with this variable is just making sure that when our if statements here are working, we want it to be displayed in the browser. So the way we can display that and check that out is we'll just grab the window object, and then we're going to grab the set interval function, which is basically just a method that calls a function at a specified interval. And the function, of course, that we want is going to be our stopwatch. And this set interval takes in 2 parameters. So first the function, and then the amount of time. And we're going to be putting 1000, which is 1000 milliseconds. So we'll say stopwatch and then time of 1,000. And if we take a look at the browser now, you can see that it's beginning to increment. And then if we just make this a bit quicker, so we'll lower it down to 1, you can see that the minutes now is also incrementing. And then if we just wait a little bit longer, it should jump to the hours. And as you can see, the hours now is also incrementing when it gets to that 60. So I'm just going to put this back to 1,000 and then comment it out. Now, of course, as you've just seen there, when this function fires off, the leading 0 disappears. And if you take a look at our demo example here and we play this, you can see that it starts incrementing as it should, but the leading 0 is still there. Now, to fix this, what we're going to need to do is actually create a couple more variables. So we'll go underneath these variables here and then create variables for that leading 0. So we'll say variables for leading 0. So we'll say let leading seconds equal 0. Duplicate this a few more times. Let leading minutes equal 0. And then obviously hours. Now what we need to do is go back inside our stopwatch function here, go underneath this if statement here, and then create some conditionals to include that leading 0 if our seconds, minutes and hours is only 1 digit. So we'll say if seconds is less than 10, we want to grab the leading seconds and then set this to that leading 0, which is a string value, but we also want to make this a string value. So we'll say toString, but we also want to make this a string value, so we'll apply the toString method, which will turn this all into a string. Else we'll just make sure that else we'll just leave the leading seconds to equal the normal seconds variable. So of course we want to create 2 more for minutes and hours. So we'll say this one is for minutes and leading minutes, hours, leading hours. And of course we're also going to have to change the variable here too. So we'll say leading hours, leading minutes, and leading seconds. So again, what we're doing here with the if statements is making sure that our leading 0 will show if our stopwatch is only showing 1 digit. And as we just seen, when we invoke the function here with a set interval, that leading 0 will disappear. But because of the statements we just created here and this variable which will display it in our browser, if I uncomment our set interval here, it should start incrementing with that leading 0. So I'll uncomment this out. And as you can see now, it's incrementing with that leading 0. And if I just speed it up, it should also apply to the seconds, minutes and hours. As you can see, it's working in the minutes. And then if we just wait a little bit longer again for the hours, the leading 0 should still stay there. And as you can see, it's working exactly the way it should. So I'll just put this back to 1,000 and just comment that out. Now we're actually invoking this stopwatch when the browser loads, because we're immediately invoking it through the window object and our set interval function. But of course we want to have more power than this, and what we want to do is actually add functionality to our buttons. So what we're going to need to do now is actually create a few variables to hold the set interval function, as well as containing the status of our stopwatch, which I'll show you guys exactly what I mean. So let's create those 2 variables. We'll actually create them up here. So variables for set interval and timer status. So we'll say let timer interval equal null, just for the time being, because we want to choose when we want the stopwatch to run, not when the page loads. And then of course create another variable for our timer status, and we're going to set this equal to a string value of stop. We now need to use these variables and apply it to our start stop button variable there. So we'll just go underneath here and then we'll grab that start stop button, add the event listener. We're going to look out for a click event. We'll grab the function. Inside of this function is going to be where we use those variables we just created. So we're going to say if timer status is equal to stopped, we then want to grab that timer interval variable and set it to our actual set interval function there. Paste that in there, close that off. We then actually want to change our button to switch from a play button to that pause button like it does in the demo example. So we'll say document dot get element by ID, grab the start stop ID there, and then grab inner HTML, set that to backticks, and then we're going to grab the icon. This has got a class of fa-solid fa-pause, and then we want to actually include the ID, which gives it that color of orange, and this has the ID of pause, and then we'll close this off. And then we also want to change the value of our status, so we're going to grab the timer status and set this equal to started. Else, if the stopwatch is now running, we also want that functionality of where we can pause the timer. So to do that, we need to grab the window object again, grab the clear interval function, and what this will do is actually stop our timer, and then insert our timer interval variable, which is in reference to our timer variable there. Close that off, and then of course when this statement rings true, we also want to change our pause button back to our play button. So we're going to say document dot get element by ID, grab that start stop btn ID again, and then change the inner HTML. This is going to equal another icon, so I dot class equals fa-solid fa-play, and then we also want to grab the ID of play so it has that green background color. Close this off, and then again obviously change the timer status back to stopped. So what we've done here inside of this function, we're just checking if the timer status is equal to stopped, the timer will start, and the play button will also change to a pause button, as well as the timer status changing to started. Else, we click the pause button, the timer will stop with our clear interval function there, and the pause button will revert back to a play button, as well as the timer status will change back to stopped. And this now should complete the functionality for playing and stopping our timer. So if we go ahead and test this, you can see it's changing to a pause button and our timer is starting to increment. If I press the pause button again, it will stop the timer and our button will revert back to the play button. So as you can see, our function is working perfectly fine there. Now we're almost done. We just need to add an event listener to our reset button here. So we'll go underneath this event listener here, grab the reset button variable, add an event listener, look out for a click event, grab the function keyword inside of this function, scroll down a bit so you guys can see. We want to grab the window object again, clear the interval so it stops, and then reference that timer interval. And then what we want when we click on this is grab the seconds. This is going to equal 0. Duplicate this 2 more times. Do the same for the minutes, and then same for the hours. And then again, we want this to actually display in the browser. So we'll say document dot get element by ID. We want to grab the timer and then grab inner HTML and then set this to the base of 0, 0 for the hours, minutes, and then for the seconds. So with this event listener we just created here for our reset button, inside of the function, we're again stopping our timer interval using the clear interval method, which is essentially just a method which clears the timer set out with a set interval method. Now this of course is referencing this set interval here. So again, this will stop our stopwatch just like it does in the else statement that we've done here. Now of course we don't just want to stop the timer, we actually want to reset it, so we revert all of our seconds, minutes and hours back to 0, which we've done here just by changing the values back to 0. And then of course we want this actually outputted into the browser, so we use the document.getElementById, grab the timer and change the inner HTML to 0 on the minutes, hours and seconds. So this now should actually reset our stopwatch to 0. So if we go ahead and test this out, press the play button so it starts incrementing, and it also reverts to a pause. We'll pause this, reverts back to a play button, and our timer stops. And then now if I click this reset button, it should reset our timer. And as you can see, our stopwatch is working with full functionality, and this now concludes our 4th project. So quite a bit more JavaScript to take in for this project. However, once it's understood, it's actually quite a fun exercise to create. Alright guys, so for our master level project we're going to be creating a to-do list, and how this to-do list works is that we simply enter a task inside the input tab here, and then we enter that task with our add button, and what this will do is add that task underneath our tab here, and when that happens we get some extra functionality. So let's go ahead and see what that looks like. So let's just enter a task here, let's say collect shopping. We'll enter that task, and as you can see that task is added underneath. And as well as that, we've got some extra functionality. So we've got this orange box here, and we've also got this trash can. Now what this orange box does is that if we complete the task and we click on this, it'll put a line through it, and if we want to get rid of the task completely, we'll just click the trash can. As you can see, it will delete that from the actual task list. Now of course this isn't the prettiest to-do list, but again this isn't really the objective of this project, so feel free to style it however you like when you guys are creating yours. Now this project is actually going to include quite a lot of what we learned in part 1, so I hope you guys are paying attention. So for our master level project, project 5, the to-do list, these are the key concepts we're going to need for the project. So we're going to be using document.getElementById. Of course again we're going to be using the event listener, e.target. We're going to be using the appendChild method, the createElement method, the parentElement method, as well as the remove and the classlist.add method. So quite a lot of the concepts we learned in part 1. So let's head into VS Code now and create our to-do list. So the first thing we need to do is create our markup for our to-do list. So we're going to wrap this in a div with the class of container, and then we're going to have a div which houses the input and the button. So we're going to call this, or we're going to give this an ID of add task container. Inside of that we're going to have our input, which should be the type of text. We're going to give it a placeholder value of enter task, which is just going to be that text inside of the input, and then we're going to give this an ID of input task, because we're going to need to grab onto this to give it an event listener in the JavaScript. And then we'll go underneath this and create our button. This button is going to have an ID of add task, because we're going to need to grab onto this as well. We're going to have an icon with a class of fa solid.fa plus, and there's our input and our button there. And then we'll go outside of this container, and we're going to have an ID which is going to be a container for all of the tasks when we do add them to our to-do list. So we're just going to give this an ID of task container, and that's all we're going to need for the markup. Let's head into the style sheet now and give this some styling. So the first thing we're going to want to do, in here is just grab the body, give this a height of 100 viewport heights, and then give it that background image, which is going to be an image folder, and it's for project 5. And then some extra styling here, just the same as the others. Now we want to align all of the content in the middle, so we're using flexbox, items to the center, so that will center our content. Let's now give some styling to the add task container, so it's got the ID of add task container. This is going to have a width of say 350 pixels, some padding, say 20 pixels on the top and bottom, and 10 pixels on the left and right, and give it some background color of white, and then our trusty friend border radius, just to give it those rounded edges, and then give it some box shadow, because always looks good with a bit of box shadow. And then we're going to also need to display this as flex, because we want to apply some flex rules to the input and the button there. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go and grab the input, give this a flex of 5 so it takes up most of the space. Give it some margin to the right, so it's a bit of space between that and the button, so we'll say about 10 pixels. Give it the border radius for those rounded edges, and then font size, let's make this a bit bigger, so say 1.2 rem, and then let's also give it some padding, say about 5 pixels, see what that looks like. Yeah, that looks pretty good. And then for the button itself, this has the ID of add task. Say font size for this, because it's an icon, we increase the size with the font size property, say 1.1 rem, maybe 1.2, yeah, that looks good. And then let's also give this some padding all the way around. And oh, I forgot to actually apply the flex properties. So let's give this a flex of 1, just so it occupies a bit of its own space. Let's give it a background color of white and the color of the icon green, and then the border, let's make it green, solid 2 pixels, classic border radius. So that's looking pretty good, and I think in the demo this has a hover effect, so let's actually apply a transition to this to 0.3 seconds, grab this and then apply the hover, and let's change the background color to green and the color of the icon to white. So let's go ahead and see if that's working. As you can see, it's got that nice hover effect now, so we know that we're going to need to click on this to add a task. Now we're not completely done with the styling, as you'll see in a moment when we enter a task, but let's first add that functionality of adding a task to our to-do list. So let's go into the JavaScript file, and then we can style the entered tasks after this. So let's head into our project5.js file. So first things first, in the JavaScript we're going to need to create some variables, one for the actual button here, one for the input, and then one for the task container, which is going to hold all the tasks. So we'll do the first one. Let's put a comment here first, variables, and we'll say add task equals document dot get element by ID. So the add task button has the ID of add task, and then one for the task container. We'll call this variable task container. That's going to equal document dot get element by ID of task container, and then we're going to have one for the input task equals document dot get element by ID, and this is going to again be for our input, which has the ID of input task. So we've got our variables. The next thing we want to do is create an event listener for our add button here, which is pretty much going to hold all of the power. So we'll say event listener for add button. So we'll say add task, which is that variable there, add event listener. We're going to look out for a click event, and let's say function, and inside of this function the first thing we're going to want to do is create a div, and we're going to store it inside a variable of task. So we'll say let task equals document dot create element, and we're going to be creating a div, and this div is essentially just going to house our task as well as that extra functionality of the check button and the delete button. So we're also going to want to give this task a class so we can style it. This is going to have class of task. So we've got our div there. Now we're going to need to insert a list item for the actual task itself, as well as that, again, that functionality of the check button and the delete button. So first we'll do the list item. It's going to equals document dot create element. We're going to create an li. Then we're going to want to, and then for this list item, we're going to want to display that text that we insert in the input or the value. So to do that, we're going to grab the li variable, and then we're going to say inner text is going to equal, and we'll do backticks here, and then we'll insert that variable of input task dot the value. Again, it's just what the value is that we're going to be inserting, so whatever task we insert inside of our input. And then of course we're going to want to append this inside of that div, which is the variable of task. So we'll append the li. So now we've got our list item. The next thing we want to include now is the check button and the delete button, so we can include some extra functionality when we do insert a task. So we'll say let's create a variable called check button. This is going to equal document dot create element, and we'll create our button, and then we'll say let's include the icon in here. So we'll say check button dot inner HTML is equal to I, say class of FA solid, to insert the quote marks there, so FA solid FA dash check, and then we'll just close that off. And then we obviously need to style this, so we're going to need to include a class, add check task, and we'll say task dot append child, and then we're obviously going to need to include this inside of our div, so we'll just say task dot append child, and then we'll append the check button, and then we'll duplicate this for our delete button, change all of these to delete button, and then this one has trash dash can, and then let's also change the class to delete task. So we've created all the elements we're going to need to include in our task. The next thing we need to do now is just make sure this actually shows and appears in our browser when we try and add a task. So we'll say if, and actually I first just want to show you that we have a bit of validation here. So if we take a look at the demo example, if we try and enter a task without actually entering anything in the input, you can see we get this alert box which says please enter task. So for this button to work, we need to either add a task, or it's going to show us this alert box to tell us to enter a task, just so it's like a bit of validation to the project. So to do that, we'll say if input task dot the value, so whatever value we put inside of our input, is equal to nothing, then we'll include that alert box, please enter a task. So we'll just see if that's working. As you can see, that alert box is working. So we'll say else, we'll then grab the task container, which is going to be the container that houses all the task, then we're going to append child, and we're going to append that task which houses the check button, the list item, and the delete button. So we'll just close that off, and we'll see now if this works. So we'll enter a task, we'll say collect shopping, hit enter, and as you can see there, it's included our list item, and it's also included our two buttons that we created. Obviously we're going to be styling this in just a moment, but one other thing I want to do just before we go into the style sheet and style this is that I want this to revert back to the placeholder text instead of holding the value we put in the input. So to do that, just grab the input task variable and the value, we want this to equal nothing. So if we go ahead and type that out again, collect shopping, enter that, you see it adds the list item, but it also removes it from the input, so we can insert another task. So we're almost nearly done here inside of the JavaScript. We'll come back and add the functionality to the checkbox and the delete button, but first let's just style all of this so it just looks a lot nicer and easier to work with. So we'll head back into the style sheet. So let's apply the styling now for our tasks when they get added to the list. So we'll just put a comment here saying styling for tasks which get added to the list. So first we'll grab the tasks, which is the div which is going to house all of that content. So we're going to just give this a width of 100%, and then we're going to give this background color of white so we can actually see the content. Let's also give this some broader radius, about 10 pixels, and then also a bit of box shadow. Always love a bit of box shadow. And then let's add a bit of padding here now, say about 5 pixels, and let's push this down a bit actually from our enter tab there. So let's give this a margin bottom of 20 pixels, so just to separate the two. And then let's also give this a bit of margin bottom as well, so it separates all of the content, all of the tasks a little bit, so just say 5 pixels. And then let's grab display flex, and let's say justify content space between, And then let's now grab the list items itself. So .task li, remove the list style bullet point. Let's give this a flex of 4, so it takes up most of the space. Let's give it a bit of padding, about 5 pixels, and let's increase the font size of these to say let's say 1.2 rem, maybe a bit bigger, 1.3. Yeah, looks good. And then let's give this a bit of margin as well, about 10 pixels. Now as for the buttons themselves, grab the task, we'll grab the buttons, and we'll give these a flex of 1. And let's also give these rounded edges, so border radius 10 pixels, and then the background color of these to be let's make them white. Now let's grab the items themselves. Actually, let's change the cursor to a pointer as well. So let's grab the task.check task. It's going to have a color of orange, and let's give them a bit of space. So margin right, about 5 pixels. And the border, say solid, 2 pixels orange. And let's increase the font size of the tick there to, let's say, 1.5 rem. It's looking good. And then let's do a similar thing for the delete. Delete task, but instead of color orange, we'll have the color of red. Won't have any margin on this, but we'll change this to red. And let's decrease the font size of this to say 1.3. Yeah, it looks better. Now both of these have a hover effect, so let's do the check first. Say background color, change that to orange, and then the color to white. Copy this, do it for the delete task, and the background color is going to be red, the color is going to be white. So we'll hover over these and you can see those are working. So all we need to do now is just go to the JavaScript and apply the functionality to this. So inside of our event listener here, we'll go underneath the input task value there, and then we'll say check button add event listener. We're going to look out for a click event function, and we're going to say the check button, and then because we need to go one element above, we need to traverse the DOM. So just like we learned in part 1, we're going to grab the parent element, and we're going to say .style .text decoration, and this is going to equal line through. So we'll check if that works. So let's enter a task. As you can see, it's putting a line through our content there. Now let's do one more for the delete button, and we'll add an event listener to this, and we'll look out for a click event, grab the function. We're going to need the event object, and we're going to say let target equals e.target, which if you remember back to part 1, this is referencing the actual element that's being clicked. And then we want to grab the target and then grab the parent element twice, so we need to traverse the DOM 2 times, and then we want to press remove. So with the target here, we're referencing the trash can or the bin or delete button. One level up is the list item, and then one level above that is the task. So that's how it will remove it. And then we'll just add this to we'll just check if this is working, sorry. So we'll enter this task, collect shopping, and then if we click the check button, it will cross it out, indicating that it's been completed. And then if we want to delete it, we just press the delete button here. So we can add more than one value here. So collect shopping, add that, and we'll do another one for walk the dog, add that, and then we can cross this out. We can delete the collect shopping. As you can see, the to-do list is fully functional. So that's actually going to be it for this project, guys. Again, the styling wasn't really the prettiest for this project. Again, this wasn't really the point of the project. Of course, this was more about how we can manipulate the DOM. But this now also concludes the part 2 video of DOM manipulation. I hope you guys enjoyed the video and learned a lot throughout the 2-part course. Be sure to leave it a like and leave any questions in the comments below that you may have, and I'll see you guys in the next video.